The first time I visited Jingmai mountain in 2010, there was about a dozen tea factories in the village. But at that time you could see that a lot of people were building walks and processing installations in their home. Nowadays, a majority of the households in Jingmai are able to process tea. I would say about 70% of the people process tea at some point during the year. So what factors have led from this transition to a few dozen to over 100 tea factories in Jingmai village? This is what we're going to explore in this video. In the late 1990s, the villagers would process the tea themselves. They would harvest the tea during the day and then bring the leaves back home and process them in basic installations. At that time, the tea was very cheap and the quality standard was not very high. This is why most of the villagers would process the tea poorly, give it a very quick shaching, very quick kilgreen process, a very light rolling. At that time they only had a wok and no machines, no proper weathering mats, and just very basic places to dry the tea. Most of the time during the rainy season the tea would not be dried properly and would end up moldy. The cheap and basic matcha processed by each of the households was collected by a few factories, a few people in Jingmai mountain. They didn't really have big factories at that time, they were just matcha collectors, so they just collected the tea from each of the villages and then sold it to a middleman who would then resell it in Monghai. This was the beginning of the privatization of the factories in Monghai, so a lot of new factories opened up, but yet Jingmai mountain was still considered remote. Its road was really bad and very few people would visit the mountain. Now in the early 2000s things changed a bit. The price of tea kept increasing every year. It was still a very cheap tea though. At that time we were starting to see the appearance of a high quality market, or at least people who made tea cared a bit more about the quality. So the first step was to increase the quality of the processing. And to do that, the factories and the government supported the installation of big factories in Jingmai. So it means that those wealthy families who were before matcha collectors, they just set up more advanced machinery and processing equipment. They built the factories and then they weren't matcha collectors anymore. They would directly buy the fresh leaves from the tea gardens and then process the tea in their home, in their brand new factory. It was mostly machines that were employed to do the shaching and to do the rolling. That led to an increase in efficiency because it was much faster to process in a big factory than for each of the farmers to process tea in the evening. So the farmers were quite happy with that because they didn't have to work anymore for long hours in the evening after a day of tea harvesting. And the bigger factories were happy too because they could get a higher quality tea, a more standardized one than what they got before. That means they could do finer blends and got a more consistent quality. So during that time, during the 2000s in Jingmai, most of the farmers would only harvest the tea leaves from their gardens and sell the fresh leaves to those big factories. They weren't tea makers anymore. Then throughout the 2000s, as the years passed by, the reputation, as you know, the reputation of poor tea kept increasing. The price kept increasing too. There was that crash in 2007. But at that time in 2007, it was still mostly big factories who processed the tea. And after 2007, we started to see a change. That change had already begun before 2007, but it really picked up speed after 2007. And that change was that the tea farmers would not sell the fresh leaves anymore to the tea factories, but instead they would process them in their newly set up small tea factory that they had put in their home. That change happened because of two main factors. First, because of the increasing valuation of those ancient tea gardens. Let me remind you that 20 years ago, those ancient tea gardens were not even harvested and they had no value basically. Let's say around 2007, the value of those ancient tea gardens got recognized, and that means that the wealth of the farmers increased drastically, not their income but their capital, And with that capital, that assets the gushu they have, they could go to the bank and take a loan at a low interest rate. And at that time, the government was supportive of this policy because they wanted also to develop the economy, the local economy, and the farmers' wealth. So in the late 2000s, the farmers got access to those cheap loans, and they could borrow a lot of money, largely enough to set up a basic tea factory. A basic tea factory is not very expensive. You could set one up for maybe $4,000 or $5,000. But before that, that was still quite a big amount of money for the farmers. The second factor is that as the renown of Jingmai mountain increased and the price of the tea increased, more and more tea buyers visited the mountain. This was even helped further by the infrastructure development that the government put in place. For example, they built a brand new road in 2010 so that Jingmai is accessible by all weather. In the past, during the rainy season, there were times when Jingmai mountain was cut from the outer world. So since the farmers had access to loans and that they had a lot of visitors, it meant that it was easy for them to find customers. They didn't really have to set up a sales channel. They could just wait at home and they would have tea buyers who would come and look for tea. So in the late 2000s and early 2010s, the right conditions were set up to see an increase in tea factories in Jingmai. And that's exactly what they did. A lot of the tea farmers set up a basic tea factory in their home. They did it for economical reasons because they wanted to capture the value of the processing. And as the price increased more and more, that value got higher and higher too. If in the 2000s, having a big factory would make the processing more efficient and therefore probably reduce the cost of producing tea, in the early 2010s, the price of tea was so high that you paid mainly for the raw material and the processing cost was only a small part. That means that whether you process it in a machine or by hand, it won't dramatically change the cost of your tea. Moreover, the small tea farmers don't have to pay for their employees. They use family work. It means that there's no extra cost actually in producing the tea yourself. It's just a little bit more work to do at night. And at that time, the price you could get for that work was very high compared to what they were used to. But when surveying the farmers, a lot of them not only mention economical aspects. Of course, they could make more money by making tea themselves. But I got the feeling that it was mostly social aspects that drove the farmers to open tea factories in their home. They did it because their neighbors did it. And actually, now in Jingmai, if you ask, are you picking tea? They will probably say, no, I'm not picking tea anymore. I'm a tea maker. I make tea myself. And it sounds like it confers you a higher social status to be a tea maker than to be a tea picker. So a lot of people wanted to have a tea factory in their house, maybe to maintain their social standing and improve their social situation in the village. Making tea yourself also makes you independent from the judgment of the fresh leaf buyers. For example, a few of the early adopters of that small-scale model were actually tea pickers who were scolded by the tea factory because they said that they were trying to sell plantation tea as leaves from the ancient tea gardens. So they were in a conflict with the big tea factory, and the tea factory was reluctant to buy their tea leaves. So this is one of the factors that pushed them to open their own tea factory. Having your own tea factory makes you more independent. You don't have to care that much about what other people think of your tea garden management and things like that. It also gives an increase in social status to hang out with Chinese tea buyers, generally wealthy Chinese who come to the mountains and want to buy your tea. So you shouldn't neglect this social aspect when thinking about the decisions that people make. Not everything is about money, and money in some way is related to the social standing you get in the village. So I would say that increasing the social standing is really the underlying drive behind creating all those small tea factories. Now I would say in the 2010s we saw quite a big increase in the quality of the processing technique. We saw people discussing a lot those processing techniques and working towards making better tea. And this is explained by the intense competition that arose from those newly built tea factories. You had, on one side, you had many buyers, and on the other side, you had many tea producers. So it meant that the competition for quality was high, and people had to work hard to improve their techniques. The big factories that were set up earlier in Jingmai are still present nowadays, and they still make good quality tea. Actually, a lot of them turn away from the machine processing and now have batteries of woks, like you could see 10 woks in their factories, and they have employees who are well trained and maybe have a more standard training program. Yet a lot of the tea factories keep making machine tea because the employees don't require as much skill to make it, and of course you can make much more in a night. Those tea factories have the advantage of being able to produce big orders. If you want 10 tons of tea in a month, you should go see a tea factory, a big tea factory, and not a small tea farmer. And that's what many big tea factories in Monghai want. And when you see all those cakes from big brands, they generally have to be made in cooperation with those larger tea processing units that we have in Jingmai, for example. So the big tea factories still have the advantage of being able to provide a standard, reliable quality in big quantity to the big actors of the market. And that's an advantage that will probably not end soon. So there's still a place for those big factories currently in Jingmai Mountain. Although some big factories now try to switch to a model in which they have contracts with several farmers. So for example, the biggest buyer of Jingmai tea, Lancang Gucha Gongse, who buys about 300 tons of Jingmai tea every year, has contracts with dozens of farmers in Jingmai. Those farmers operate medium-sized tea factories. These factories are set up by the engineers of the big tea factory, of the big tea company, and they have a contract, and they have facilities. For example, they have an advance in capital, so they don't have to advance so much capital to pay for the leaves. And they still process mainly by machines, but they have some tiny changes that they make to the machines. They tend to use higher quality machines and process in smaller batches. So it's not handmade tea, but still decent tea. Now the main problem for the big tea factories is sourcing good material, because you can think that if the tea farmers have their own tea factory, they will tend to keep the best material for themselves, for their own customers, and sell their second quality material to the big factories. And that's usually what happens, and the big factories have no control over this. This is why some big factories prefer to only deal with people who don't process tea at all in their home, so that they make sure they get all of their tea. But yeah, generally you could say that small-scale tea producers have access to better material than their larger counterparts. We usually say that high-quality tea comes from mountains where you have small-scale farmers, and that's true, but the logic is a bit twisted here. It's because the mountain is renowned that you can have those tea farmers existing. If you look at most of the places with no reputation, they tend to have more big factories, because nobody will visit their tea mountain, so the small-scale tea farmers would be hard put to finding customers in the mountain. They would have to go to the cities and maybe open tea shops, and that requires capital that they don't have access to, because if their tea gardens are not valuable, they cannot take a loan using that tea garden. So I would say that renown comes first in a tea mountain, and small tea producers come second. They need the prestige of that mountain to be able to set up their factory and run it and find customers. You could say that with the development of the internet and social media nowadays, things are changing, because from your tea garden you can call your customers in Beijing and Guangzhou and New York and sell them tea. So we might see also a change in the not so famous tea mountains, and maybe nowadays there are more opportunities for these small-scale tea producers to exist. There's also an increased demand for tea from small farms. There is an extra value associated with the small tea farmers, the charm of the small farmer. And this is something that the farmers can tap on. We tend to have a dualistic vision where you have the big industry and the small farmers full of charm, but actually the truth is always in the middle, and you have different scales of operations. In Yunnan, you don't find much of the big industrial size. Usually the big actors, they still have to deal at some points in the chain with smaller actors. Even the biggest tea factory in Jingmai is not that big compared to what you'd find in India or Kenya, for example. As of 2019, most of the small-scale tea farmers mainly sell maocha, that means loose-leaf pu'er tea. I think in the next years we'll see more and more tea farmers having their own brand. Why? Because of the cost of logistics nowadays is extremely cheap in China. You can sell 10 kilograms of tea from Jingmai to Beijing for about $6 and it will arrive in only 3 days. So that opens the possibility for retail trade directly from the mountain to the customer's house. The online retail business is huge these years in China, and so the logical step following that dynamic would be to see many farmers having their own brand and having a direct connection on social media with their customers, so that the retail customers can actually see their tea being made in the mountain and have it in their home just a few weeks after that. And that's the model that we're promoting on Farmer Leaf, and I think this is a model that will be followed in the future in many tea mountains. The introduction of these new business models is slow because it requires a different kind of education, and maybe we can expect the next generation of tea farmers to be more proficient in the use of social media. But we shouldn't neglect the leverage that social pressure gives. People want to increase their social standing in their village, and to do that they have to keep up with the pace of development. So in the 2000s that meant building your own tea factory, and maybe in the late 2010s it will mean having your own brand and running your online shop or something like that. Now at this point it's a bit speculative, but we'll see what the future holds. Thank you for watching and see you next time.